I am from actually from Ancona, so which is my hometown, and I've been studying the history of Jews now in Ancona for quite a long time, and this is how I realize also that the communities of Ancona and Ferrara are absolutely central to understand the history of Sephardic Jews in Italy, and also the beginning of, let's say, the the flows of many Sephardic families around the Mediterranean and also Central and Western Europe. So the main let's say, when I talked to Tom and David at the beginning, our first idea was to, they asked me if I wanted to do maybe a seminar about the history of the Jews in Venice, and then I realized, well, there is quite a lot of stuff on YouTube, and there are many people who can do this better than I do, and so on. So basically, my point, then I realized also how little then these Sephardic communities of Ancona and Ferrara were studied compared to Livorno and Venice. This is also because, in fact, the Sephardic community of Ancona and Ferrara were prominent in Italy in the 16th century, but not in the 17th, for reasons which we will see later on. So contrary to Venice and Livorno, which took, let's say, became prominent in the 17th century and also in the 18th, then of course they were these two communities of Ancona and Ferrara were a bit overlooked. So my, let's say, my goal is to perhaps to give some elements about how the competition between different Italian states provoked migration flows among Sephardic families from Spain and Portugal in Italy, but also beyond Italy, for instance, to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Amsterdam, and so on, and to explain what was the situation in Italy in the 16th century, because in fact, many families they don't realize that in fact before, I don't know, before they were in Venice, or before they were in Amsterdam, or before they were in Salonika, in fact they passed through Ancona and Ferrara for reasons which I will explain. And then at the end I will also give some examples of some families which indeed you can find from around different places in the Mediterranean, but also in Amsterdam, London, and so on, Hamburg, and so on. So maybe if we can start the slides, David, I will ask David to, if you can show the first slide. Right. Next slide, please. Yeah. So in fact, this is a timeline of the Sephardic Jewish presence in Italy in the 16th century and the main events. As we all know, in 1492, we have the mass exodus of Spanish Jews escaping forced conversion, and many of them end up in Italy. Some of them end up in many in South Italy for a very specific reason, because at the time, the the king of Spain was Ferrante first. Ferrante was his Italian name, but he's known internationally with Ferdinand the First, and he invited these Sephardic Jews escaping from Spain to go to Naples. And we have we have the records of the ships which arrived in Naples in 1492. I've been studying one specific one since many years, one specific Sephardic families. I hope one day I'll be able to write a book about it. These are called the Al Costantini, and in fact they leave Calatayud in Spain. They the whole community of Calatayud, but also Saragossa and Huesca and so on. They rent a ship in Tortosa, and then they arrive to Naples. But it was not the only port of destination. In fact, other Jews arrived in Genoa, not as many as in Naples. Some of them arrived in Rome, and so on. So 1492, we have the first, let's say, influx of Spanish Jews going to Italy. There was in Rome at the time, in 1492, a pope, which was called Alexander VI, he was Spanish, and he had some sympathy for the plight of these Sephardic Jews. So he let them stay in Rome. Um, in 1493, some of the Jews who had who went to Sicily, they are expelled from Sicily because the Spanish crowd decides to expel the Jews from Sicily. So they have to go somewhere else. So we have a first, let's say, first flow of Jews going to to not only to the Eastern Mediterranean, but to the Ottoman Empire, but also, for instance, to Ancona and to other Italian towns. Um, in 1497, we have the Spanish Jews which are banished from all the territories of Venice, because Venice at the time was trying to align itself with the policy of the Spanish kings. And then we have in 1510 a partial expulsion from the Kingdom of Naples. Basically, many Jews have to have to leave the Kingdom of Naples, which was basically South Italy without Sicily and Sardinia. But the wealthiest of them, they can still stay. For instance, the famous Abarban family, they can stay, and they remain in Naples. However, in 1514, we have the Venice Senate providing some fiscal privilege to the Levantine merchants importing to Venice some products from the regions of Morea and Romania. So this happened 2 years before the establishment of the ghetto for the Jews, and 27 years before the so ghetto Novo was the first one established in 1514, and 27 years before the Ghetto Vecchio was established in 1541, specifically for the Levantine Jews. At the same, so this doesn't mean that Venice allows at the time, in that moment, Portuguese, let's say, Jews of Portuguese origin to settle in Venice. But there were some Levantine Levantine merchant. They say, okay, you can indeed, you have some fiscal privilege to in order to trade between Venice and Romania and Morea. And then in 1526, so here comes into the limelight Antwerp. We have, and the reason I'm talking about Antwerp will be shown a bit later. We have an imperial ordinance authorizing Portuguese Christians, so of course including converted Jews, to go to live in the Flemish countries under the Kingdom of Spain. And we have here, for instance, the famous Diogo Mendes and his family. Diogo Mendes was nicknamed the King of Pepper in Europe, and he goes to live in Antwerp, and they enter into, once they were in Antwerp, into contact with the existing Sephardim of Italy and Ragusa. Ragusa is the Italian name for Dubrovnik, which at the time was very much an Italian town. And then in 1530, in the 30s, the Inquisition starts operating in Portugal. And this is also the time where we see the first flows of Portuguese Jews starting to come to Italy. But coming to Italy where? David, could you please change? Yes. They come to Ancona. They start coming to Ancona because in 1532, Cardinal Accolti invites the merchants from the Eastern Mediterranean, Turks, Jews, and Greeks, to establish themselves in Ancona. So this was one of the last things he did before dying, because he dies, one last good things he did before dying, because he dies in the same year. And basically, he tells the Jews, okay, if you come here, you don't have to wear the O sign, which at the time Jews had to wear, which was imposed on Italian Jews who were bankers. Many of them were bankers and moneylenders. So they could, the cardinal says, okay, if you come to Ancona, you can settle there with a lot of privilege, but also you are free to go back to the East and come back whenever you want. So it was an open invitation. And very importantly, it was an invitation explicitly extended to Jews from Spain and Portugal. So he must have known, obviously, that Jews of Portuguese origin had to be they were new Christians, so had to be baptized at some stage. But the invitation is extended also to them, quite amazingly. Then we have in 1544 a papal edict, one in 1544 and one in 1553, also giving Portuguese Jews the same benefits of the Levantine Jews in Ancona. So basically, you have the state of a church who says, okay, we close our eyes, and Portuguese Jews, you Jews of Portuguese origin, you are welcome to come and settle in Ancona. So we have, let's say, that Portuguese Jewish nation is created for the first time in Ancona. And by justifying this, the state of the church says, well, this is because we reckon the extraordinary economic changes which these Sephardic Jews are bringing, once they come to Ancona. And then, so in 1544, also at the same time, the Duke of Ferrara, Ercole II, provides also privilege to Portuguese Jews, inviting them to come and live at Ferrara, because the other Italian states, they see what's happening in Ancona. They see that the state of the church is, let's say, providing benefits to the Jews to come and settle there. So they think, okay, if it's done in Ancona and the church is fine with it, then we can do it. We can do it too. So the Duke of Ferrara, Ercole II, they had already given some privilege to Spanish Jews, but in 1534, so let's say the grandson Ercole II, who was the grandson of Ercole I, the first who had given some benefits to Spanish Jews, he established another decree who includes also the Portuguese Jews. They say, okay, we will treat you exactly in the same way in which we are treating the Spanish Levantine Jews. So they are all defined in the decree as Spanish Jews, Ebrei Hispani. So in this way, the Portuguese Jews are at the same time, they can also come to Ferrara and benefit of the same privilege which the Spanish Jews were already benefiting. So the issue that they are new Christians, it is completely avoided in the legislation. The term, let's say, Marrani, or Cristãos Novos, or Portugal. So it never appears in the legislation, but the Duke of Ferrara knew what he was doing, because in all the letters that he was receiving from the ambassador of Ferrara from Antwerp or Venice and Rome, they were very much talking about Portuguese Jews and Marranos, and of the fact that they were indeed of Christian. They had been converted in the past. So in 15 and then let's say these extraordinary privilege that the popes are giving to the Jews, they start in 1532, and basically there is Jews live in peace and in calm in Ancona, and mainly in Ancona, because that was the main port to the east, until 1555. Because we know that the Portuguese nation in Ancona is created in the 30s, because before it was believed that, well, it was created after the expulsion from the Kingdom of Naples in 1541. That is not the case. It was already in Ancona before the expulsion from the Kingdom of Naples, because when there is the expulsion from the Kingdom of Naples, many Jews also arrived to Ancona, but the Portuguese nation was already established there. And then in 1537, Venice enters into a war with Turkey, and this benefits a lot let's say, benefits a lot Ancona and Ferrara, because the trade between Venice and the Ottoman Empire is interrupted, and therefore we see the establishment of a new trade flows between Antwerp, Ancona, Dubrovnik, and the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, authorities in Ancona and Ferrara, of course, they see this as a huge opportunity. So in 1539, the Duke of Ferrara invites explicitly the 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 the, um, the Jews of Antwerp to come to Ancona. So he sends an envoy with the task of facilitating the arrival of Portuguese Jews if they wanted to come to Ferrara. And this is indeed the time is ripe for that, because between 1540 and 1544, because in the meanwhile we know that of course Spain had taken possession of Antwerp and Flanders. So there was a viceroy there, and so Jews are starting to be harassed, and some of these Jews from they decide, okay, we'll accept the invitation from the Italian authorities. We will go to Ferrara. But there is a problem, and the problem, maybe we can go next slide, David, please. There is a problem. The problem is that to get there, they had to travel through Lombardy and Milan. And Lombardy and Milan was, since 1535, under also Spanish domination. There was un viceroy, and of course, you had the local authorities which were harassing these Portuguese Jews. They were putting them in prison, confiscating their goods, and so on. So there is a huge problem on how to get to Ferrara from Antwerp by land. So they tried to looking for other routes and so on. 1541, as I mentioned, we have the second and final expulsion from the Kingdom of Naples, and the Abrabanel family themselves arrive in Ferrara. You know, Abrabanel was the most important Jewish family in Castilla before the expulsion. And we also have, so there is this book, which is called the famous book, The Familiarity of Stranger, which is written by Trivellato, and it's very much about the Ergas family. And in the book, she mentions the fact that Isaac Ergas appears in Livorno in 1598 and so on, but she doesn't say from where. Probably she doesn't know from where. And, and we know that indeed Isaac Ergas de Portugalia was in the 40s moving between Ancona and Ferrara. So and of course, if you check the names, let's say the which were bouncing from grandfather to grandson and so on of this Ergas family, you see Isaac Abraham, and so on, and we see exactly the same name in the Ergas family in Ancona and Ferrara. So Isaac Abraham. So it is very likely that this is indeed the same family, and before that, half a century before appearing in Livorno, they were indeed living in Ancona and Ferrara. 1547, there is a new papal edict, indeed asking again Portuguese Jews to come to live, to come to settle in Ancona. And in this context, well, not in this context, but at the same time, of course, Ferrara was also continuing its policy about attracting Sephardic Jews, both Levantine and from Portugal. So we have Gracia Mendes, the famous Beatrice de Luna, who arrives in Ferrara after having lived 2 years in Venice, coming from Antwerp. So she settles in Ferrara. But then there is a problem in Ferrara that it seems that there is a plague, and the population gives the fall to these newly arrived Portuguese Jews. So in fact, what happens is that hundreds of them leave for the Eastern Mediterranean, mainly Salonika. We have the contracts that they sign with the ship owners to take. It's not clear, exactly clear, how many of them lease Ferrara for the East, but we know that there must be at least 300, of them, based on how big were the ships and so on. But there might be, of course, contracts who escape our attention. But let's say an estimation is that at least 300 of them go to to the Eastern Mediterranean. Other of them, they hide in the countryside. And then in 1550, there is a new edict of the Duke Ercole II and say to attract Spanish and Portuguese Jews to Ferrara. So those who had moved to the countryside, they come back. But in the meanwhile, many of them, either some of them moved to the Eastern Mediterranean and others to Ancona. I forgot to say that Ferrara and Ancona were very much linked because, in fact, they were part of the same trading route, which connected Florence, Ferrara, France, and then Ancona to then Dubrovnik and the Eastern Mediterranean. So Ancona and Ferrara were cooperating in trade against Venice. Venice was autonomous when it came to trade, and but they were very worried about this Ancona Dubrovnik route, because in fact they established, thanks also to a Portuguese, they established an alternative route from Venice to Split. In 1515, Venice, they decide on some draconian measure for anyone caught trading with Marrano. And it is, again, they were not so much, they don't do it because of any pressure of the church, but because they try to allow, they were in a war with the Ottoman Empire, so they try to align themselves with the policy of Spain, of the Spanish kings. Next slide, please. So at that moment, around 1550, we know that there are around 20,000 Jews living in Salonika, Sephardic Jews. So part of which, of course, part had arrived directly from Spain, but part of which had arrived from Italy due to what happened, for instance, in Ferrara in the 40s and so on. 1555, 1556, we have the tragic events in Ancona. We have the end of the Portuguese Jewish nation in Ancona, because there is a new pope, Paul IV, and he says, well, these are all a bunch of converted Jews. They were Christian, then they came back to Judaism, and so on. So, in fact, some of them managed to escape, but around 24 of them are burned at stake, and 100 of them are then put on the ships of the States of the Church. They were rowing and so on, but they managed to escape in Malta very, very soon. So and then in the same year, so as I said, we have the end of the Portuguese Jews, but he tolerates, nevertheless, those Sephardic Jews which were coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, so the so-called Levantine, which were not, as they didn't come from Portugal, they had never been baptized, they were simply expelled. 1555, we have new privilege in Ferrara for Portuguese and Spanish Jews. So, of course, some of the Portuguese Jews in Ancona who have to leave in a hurry in order not to be put into prison or executed by the Pope, they moved to Ferrara. 1558, and okay, let's say as a consequence of the fact that these Portuguese Jews were burned at stake in Ancona, we have Beatrice de Luna, Gracia Mendes, who tries to boycott the Jewish community of Ancona, and he said, and then so some Portuguese Jews, they go to Pesaro, because the Duke of Pesaro and Urbino, he wanted to also to take advantage of this boycott and try to increase the trade going through Pesaro. But Pesaro had, Ancona has a deep harbor, and Pesaro couldn't. The water is not very deep in Pesaro, so they could not attract big ships and so on. So the Duke is disappointed, and in 1558, the Portuguese Jews are also expelled from Pesaro. In 1565, the Senate of Venice discussed the expulsion of Sephardic Jews. This is not carried out. In 1569, the Pope decides to expel all Jews from the Papal State except from Rome and Ancona. And at the beginning, he said, no, you can only stay in Rome. But then he understands that these Jews in Ancona are very important for trades with the Eastern Mediterranean. So then, of course, they also let them stay in Ancona. But at that time, Ancona didn't have any more Portuguese Jews because they had been either expelled or put in prison or executed. And in 1570, there is a new war of Venice against the Ottoman Empire, and Venice confiscates the goods of the Levantine Jews living in Venice and also put them in prison. Because for Venice, these Levantine Jews, Venice considered very much these Levantine Jews as agents for the Ottoman Empire, because they were coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. They were many of them were Ottoman subjects. So the situation for Levantine Jews is very bad in Venice during the 3 years of the war until the peace treaty is signed between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. So there is a safe conduct and this is a key moment. This is a key moment for the history of Sephardic Jews in Venice, because for the first time, until then, Venice was basically closing one eye or two when it came to the fact that some Levantine Jews were living in Venice. But here, for the first time, Venice explicitly asks, let's say, Spanish and Portuguese Jews to come to live in Venice for a period of 2 years. The church complains because, and then he says, well, but you also have, come on, you also have Levantine Jews in Ancona in this moment. And then the church said, well, the Pope said, well, yes, but these are Levantine. There is a huge difference between these Levantine Jews in Ancona and these Portuguese Jews in Venice. So this very, very wide safe conducts that Venice provides for Spanish and Portuguese Jews to come and live in Venice, they say, okay, you will, and this is very important. They say also, you will not be punished for having lived as Christians in previous time. And Venice says, okay, they make reference in this legislation to the laws of all other Italian states, including the past laws, which were very, very tolerant, of the popes, of the state of the church. Because, popes are supposed never to make a mistake. So Venice says, well, if you had this legislation, yes, we reckon that the situation now is different, but between 1532 and 1555, you have yourself welcome all these Spanish and Portuguese Jews in Ancona. So of course, this cannot be a mistake. And this is very important because also for the rest of the 16th century, the legislation of other Italian states, they keep making reference to what was the situation in the state of the church in the 30s, 40s, and the first half of the 50s. And here we have, more or less at the same time, we have one Jew, which was called Daniel Rodriga. He was of Portuguese origin, and he is the one who proposes to the Venetian Senate the establishment of a free transit at Split, so the establishment of an alternative trading route which linked Italy with what is now Yugoslavia. So as an alternative to the competition that Venice had of the established trade route between Ancona and Dubrovnik. So there is created a new trade route between Venice and Split. Next slide, please. However, in 1581, things change in Ferrara because the Pope keeps pressuring the Duke of Ferrara, and the Duke of Ferrara put in jail tens of Portuguese Jews, accusing them that they were circumcised in Ferrara. So he puts them in jail. This provokes, of course, a big problem for the Portuguese community. But then 1 year later, he changes his mind again, and he said, no, no, okay. So he says, okay, we grant you new privilege, and also for Portuguese Jews. In 1586, the Pope allows the Jews to come back to live in the state of the church, but only in major towns. But then they are expelled again in 1593. So basically, we can say that from 1569, the only two Jewish communities remaining in the state of the church were those in Roma and Ancona. So I mentioned the Portuguese Jews, Daniel Rodrigues, and he, in 1589, he submits a text of a charter granting extensive privilege to Levantine Spanish and other Jewish merchants to settle in Venice with their family. Now, the council of the five wise people in Venice, they say, oh, this is a great idea. And they even add the explicit word Levantini and Ponentini to the text which was proposed by the Barbosa. And Ponentini in Italy was a synonym of Portuguese Jews at the time. So Venice says, okay, we make this explicit. They can come for 10 years. And then the Senate approves this with a great majority and even changes the 10 years with 25 years. So here we have, and how does Venice justify this? They say, well, yes, we know, yes, they're Portuguese Jews, yes, they were likely baptized before, but the fact that they come here to live in Venice is for the great benefit of Christianity, because otherwise these people, which are very talented, they're very wealthy, they're very industrious, otherwise they would go to live in the Ottoman Empire, and they would make the Ottoman Empire rich and not Venice. And by the way, Venice says, you know what? Because of course the popes were not happy. They say, you popes, you had yourself in the past granted bigger privilege to these Portuguese Jews in Ancona. So Venice, then Venice, we have this legislation which then increases the arrival of Portuguese Jews to Venice. And in 1591, Tuscany takes notice of what is happening in other places in Italy, including Venice, and they provide, the Grand Duke of Tuscany provides many privileges to Sephardic Jews to settle in Livorno. He wanted to create a major trading center in Livorno. It was, in the meanwhile, the Atlantic trade has taken root, so it was much easier for ships to arrive in Livorno from the Atlantic to trade in Italy than to arrive in Ancona and Venezia, because then they had to circumnavigate Italy. So, so we have two versions of this charter, one in 1591 and one in 1593, and this charter makes explicit reference to Levantine, Ponentine, Spanish, and Portuguese Jews to come to settle in Livorno. They give the same privilege that they had in Venice, with numerous also new ones, very attractive additional ones. And they say, okay, this will be valid for 25 years, and after that it will be renewable. And then they say, whoever comes, even if it was baptized, there will be no investigation, no accusation, no denunciation can be made against these newcomers, even if they had previously lived as Christians. So in addition to that, Jews could do everything, not only trade, but they could do everything they wanted, all sorts of jobs. And also, very importantly, for the first time, they can purchase real estate, which is something that in Venice they couldn't do. And they could also, for instance, they could employ Christian servants, which in Venice also they couldn't do. So we continue. In 1594, there is no Portuguese community anymore in Ancona, but of course the competition between Italian states continues. So new privileges are granted by the popes for Levantine Jews to come to settle in Ancona. 1597, Ferrara, unfortunately for them, they become part of the Papal State. So all Portuguese Jews leave Ferrara. Leave Ferrara, and this is very important. So a few of them go with the Grand Duke to Modena, but Modena was not a town which offered a lot of commercial opportunities, and many of them go to Venice. In Venice, meanwhile, Venice continued to renew every 10 years the chapter. For instance, after 1598, it is renewed in 1608, then in 1624, and so on. And in all this renewal, they continue to invite Levantine and Ponentine Portuguese Jews families to come to Venice, increasing the trade, the well-being, and benefiting the custom. This is how they justify the fact they keep inviting Portuguese Jews to come to Venice. And they say, well, we are in competition with Ancona and Dubrovnik and Livorno and so on. So here you can see how big the competition was between Italian states to come to attract these Jews coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, but also coming from who had lived, who were of Portuguese origin, even if obviously someone in the family must have been baptized. And this is justified both with pragmatic reason, and at the same time, it is also justified with the fact that we are just providing, we are just doing. What we're doing is not very different from what the popes themselves did between 1532 and 1555. And according to Christian, to Catholic dogma, popes can never make mistakes. So if the state of the church did it during 23 years, it is obvious that we can do it as well. So next slide, please. So to conclude, we have a lot of I think it's impossible to study the evolution of one Sephardic community in one town or state in Italy, making abstraction of the situation and the evolution of the situation of other cities or states where a Sephardic community existed, where continuous flow among Italian towns due to competition, due to evolving legislation, and also due to expulsion. And the same applies also in the 16th century between the Sephardim in Italy and Sephardic community in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans and Western Europe. This competition between Italian states and Italian states benefit the Jewish Levantine and Ponentine merchants. And by the beginning of the 17th century, the situation had stabilized. And they had privilege in a number of Italian towns and states. Now, in the 17th century, we see that some or many of them, they start leaving Europe, but it was not because they don't leave Europe because there is persecution by the state of the church, because the situation had stabilized from a legal point of view. It was because the 17th century was a difficult century for Italy due to the shift towards the Atlantic trade, to which Italy did not participate or participated only marginally. Therefore, we see all this immigration flow to Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, and so on in the 17th century. But Ton knows much better than me how many Jews from Venice arrive in Amsterdam, of course, or even from Livorno in the 17th century. But the competition in the 16th century benefited Levantine and Portuguese Jews in spite of the presence of the state of the church, whose policy was constantly changing, and in spite of the disaster in Ancona in 55, 56. When this disaster is the fact that many Portuguese Jews were burned and staked, and this which dispelled the end of the Portuguese Jewish community in Ancona. Next, please. So we can say that in the 16th century there were departures from Italy to the Eastern Mediterranean, but there was also continuous influx of Sephardi Jews from Portugal and the Ottoman Empire, which also will continue in the 17th century. We have flows going in both directions. from Italy to the Eastern Mediterranean and from the Eastern Mediterranean to Italy. Some parts of central and northern Italy were therefore a place of refuge for Sephardim in the 16th century, which was, as we know, a very difficult century for Jews in Europe for many reasons. The role of Ancona and Ferrara has been often been overlooked, contrary to the situation in Livorno and Venice, but it is of central importance in this respect. There was great economic cooperation between Ancona and Ferrara. Ferrara was a point of transit for goods which they reach from, sorry, all right, reach from reach northern Central Europe from the Eastern Mediterranean via Ancona and vice versa. And many of the Sephardic Jews, you can see from the archival sources that they lived in both towns, they operated in both towns, they moved from one town to the other. And this continues for the whole century when it comes to Levantine Jews, and for part of a century only when it comes to Portuguese Jews. And something which needs to be also properly explained is the fact that the Portuguese nation of Ferrara gave a fundamental contribution to the establishment of the Portuguese nation in Venice, a point which is often overlooked because many of these Jews, we had a first flow due to Papal legislation of Jews from Ancona to Ferrara, but we also had another flow of Jews from Ferrara to Venice. And in fact, the community of Venice, the way in which the community was managed, the internal laws and so on, very much they took them from the existing already, let's say, internal rules of the community from Ferrara. Next, please. So we see that the benefits for Levantine Jews were often extended, implicitly or explicitly, to Portuguese Jews. For the church, the term of Levantine Jews was synonymous with no baptism. They were expelled from Spain. They went to the Eastern Mediterranean. They cannot be baptized, these people. We leave them alone. We leave them in peace. But the Italian states constantly look for the ways to overcome the problem of Jews of Portuguese origin. And as I said before, all states made continuous references to the privilege granted by the church to Portuguese Jews before 1555 in order to defend their policy. The issue of Portuguese origin baptized Jews sometimes was overlooked in the legislation, sometimes was ignored, but many times was also explicitly mentioned. We have situations in which, for instance, the church demands to to put in jail or to this or that Jews because they had proof that indeed they lived as Christians when they were in Portugal and so on. And the way that some of the states tackle this is either to resist to what the church wants, or sometimes to say, well, we put this or that person in prison, but you know what? It escaped. So I'm sorry, we cannot give him to you. Other times, we have two different versions of a charter that the states were giving to Portuguese Jews. Let's say one charter, the original, which was given to the community itself, which made explicit reference to the fact that they were of Portuguese origin, they were Christian, and so on. But then we have another charter, which maybe is not signed by the Duke, but it's signed by the first secretary, and which we have other words. So this is what we find in the archives, because they didn't want to this to be seen by the church. Venice, as I said, there was a great trade competition with Ancona and Ferrara. Venice was better suited for trade and distribution of goods north of the Alps, but Ancona and Ferrara were better suited for trade with Florence and the Balkans. However, as I said, contrary to Ancona, Florence, and Ferrara, also Savoy, Venice needed less the help of foreign merchants because it was a powerful maritime state by itself. So Venice never gave, let's say, never provided privilege to Sephardic and Portuguese Jews up to the same level which other Italian cities gave. So the policy for a long time was not to explicitly invite Jewish merchants to the city, but maybe to close an eye about the fact that they were there. As I said, this changes towards the end of the century. to close an eye to the fact that they were there and to grant them only temporary admission, which was not the case with other Italian states. So all in all, we can say that the privilege provided by Venice to Sephardic Jews were given later compared to other Italian towns or states, and were not as ample as those of the other Italian town states in the 16th century. Next one, please. So up to now, let's say, up to now, I gave you general information. So, and you might wonder if, how can I prove all this? So I decided to provide you with some examples, and to make things, let's say, absolutely neutral from, I say, okay, let's take letter A and B. So the first two letters of the alphabet, I will not look for these families all around the alphabet to provide the example I want. Let's see some of these families. We have the Abenatar. We know that they were in Ancona in 1585, in Venice in 1601. In Amsterdam, we know that they arrived from Venice, but also they arrived from Portugal. So there are some of them from Venice, some from Portugal. Then we find them in 1617 in Hamburg, and they arrived from Portugal via Amsterdam. And then in the 17th century, we also find them in Padua, Trieste, and Genoa. The Abendana family, we find them in Venice from 1630, but they were in Amsterdam since 1681. But we have some Abendana who arrived in Amsterdam in 1628 from Venice, but also from Portugal and also from Hamburg. We find them in Hamburg. In Hamburg, they had arrived from Antwerp, but via Venice. So it was a long road and so on. Those we find in Livorno, they do come from Venice, and we find them in Verona. And then we find also another family, which is called Abendana, but Abendanan in Venice, one more letter in Venice from 1622. The Aben David, they were in Venice already in 1556, but we find them in Ancona also in 1555. Where did they come from? The Aben David in Ancona, from Bitola, North Macedonia. So it was on the route of the Balkans, the trading route that reached Dubrovnik and then Ancona. Next slide, please. No slide.
This is the next slide.
Right. So then we have the Aben-Yakar. They were in Venice already in 1567, and those we find in Amsterdam in 1623, they are from Portugal. But they were already in Cremona in the 15th century in Italy. The Aboab, this is a very interesting family because we find them in Pisa in 1585. They came from Portugal. In Padua in 1603 and in Venice in 1625. Those in Venice derived from Hamburg, but also we have a separate branch arriving in Venice in 1628 from Portugal via Pisa. In Amsterdam, we find them in 1614, but another branch in 1637 arriving from Venice. We see that they were in Venice from 1625. Those in Verona, they arrived from Hamburg via Venice. And we find them also in 1660 in Hamburg from Portugal. The famous Abrabanel family, they are in Venice since 1503, arriving from Spain via Naples. Some of their descendants stays in Spain, but we also find them in Ferrara in 1541, and they stay in Ferrara half a century. Then we find them in Amsterdam from 1615 and Hamburg from 1641. Next slide, please. The Abudente, again, we find them in Ancona in 1545, and then we find them later on in Venice in the 17th century, in Amsterdam from 1617, in Hamburg, those in Hamburg arrived from Amsterdam, and in Padua. The Alfarin, we find them in Ferrara in 1549. Around half a century later, we find them in Venice, 1597, then in Pisa in 1602, and then Padua and Hamburg. The Almosnino, they were in Rome in 1511. We find them later on in Ancona, Mantova, Venice, and so on. Next slide, please. The Altaras in Ancona from 1551, and then a branch moved to Venice in 1615. But you know that there were also other Altaras which were living in Turkey and Sarajevo. The Attias in Ancona from 1515. These were Portuguese Jews. And we also find them in Amsterdam in 1616, Hamburg 1617, and Venice in 1629. The Alcostantini. This is an extremely interesting family. I've been studying them for a long time now. They were expelled from Spain, they went to Crete, and then as a consequence of the Venetian-Ottoman War in the 16th century, 17th century, they moved to Ancona, but also Padova and Venice and Pesaro. So you find them at the same time in the main commercial hubs of Eastern Italy. Also, we find them also in Thessaloniki in 16th centuries, Nicopolis, Ferrara, Livorno, Nice, Marseille. Why is it an interesting family? Because there is evidence that indeed it is the same family. There was only one family which was expelled from Spain in 1492, and then they reinvent. In Spain, they were extremely important because they had been the private secretaries, the doctors, and the translator of the kings of Aragon. And then they transformed themselves into a trading Sephardic family. And they spread all over in many places in the Mediterranean. Next, please. The Baruch in Venice from 1597. We know that they came from Salonika. Previously, we know that some Baruch were in Ferrara and Ancona. In Amsterdam since 1616, in Hamburg from 1617, and so on. The Baruch Carvalho. This is a family which is mentioned a lot in the book of Francesca Trivellato, The Familiarity of Strangers. So they were linked to the Ergas family. We find them in Venice since 1644, but also in Livorno, also in Amsterdam, and arriving directly from Portugal, while those in London arrive from Livorno and Pisa. The book does not say it, but there is archival sources which show why at least one branch of them moved from Venice to Livorno. They moved not for better commercial opportunities, but because they didn't want to pay taxes to the Jewish community. So they were excommunicated actually in Venice. The Belillos in Venice since 1624. I mentioned the Belillos because they were indeed linked to the Baruch Carvalho as far as trade is concerned. Then the Bueno, we find them in Ferrara, again Ferrara in 1573. Then we know that there are some Bueno coming to Pisa from Flanders in 1606, Venice since 1620, Amsterdam 1607. They were Portuguese Christian, but again, some other Bueno from Spain, 1625, from Portugal, from Bayonne, and then they were also in Hamburg. Is it the last slide, David?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. I want to make 2 points here. The first point, it is the following. It is not because the surname is the same that is the same family. So in fact, it is a matter of studying, researching, indeed, where people with this surname came from, where they came from, where did they go? Because it's clear, for instance, in the case of the Bueno family, they were coming from all over the place. So it's not in the Al-Costantini family. Yes, it is one family originally. In the case of the Bueno family, probably not. In the case of the Baruch family, probably not. There were people sharing the same surname. And also the 16th century was a complicated century in terms of surname, as far as Portuguese Jews are concerned, because we find even brothers with different surnames, because the Portuguese Jews, they wanted to hide maybe the fact that they were living as Christians before. So you need a great work of reconstructions of this family, of these flows, and so on. And the second thing I want to mention is that we will not go to now surname by surname, but roughly half of the families or the surname which I mentioned here, we find them in Thessaloniki, in the 16th century. So just 1 second. For instance, the Atias, we find them in Thessaloniki. The Al-Costantini, we find them in Thessaloniki. Baruch as well, Beno as well. We find them in the 16th century, sometimes very early in the 16th century in Thessaloniki. And we know the Aboab as well, the Abrabanel as well. So we know that it was not, let's say, the importance of Italy is not only that many Sephardic Jews who arrived in Italy in the 16th century from Spain and Portugal, then they moved on to the east. There was also a contrary flow from the east to Italy again. So, and this is the point I wanted to make, that it is extremely important to not to study a single family or single town in isolation, because you had these flows which move from Italy to the Eastern Mediterranean, from Eastern Mediterranean to Italy, and then across Italian city, across Italian states, and then from Italy to Amsterdam, to Hamburg, to London, and so on. So it was, let's say that Sephardic Jews were moving a lot. They were following, trading patterns, and they were always sometimes looking for new opportunities and so on. So this is to say that it would be indeed extremely interesting in the future to do a few things. First thing is to understand where these, as I said, these families came from, where did they originate, from Spain, from Portugal, when, where, and so on. Second, to ascertain whether these people with the same surname, they belong to the same family or not. It will be important to see how they move from one town or country to the other, and what is the relationship between the families with the same surname in some places. And as I said, it is absolutely key not to limit yourself to study a single family or a single town when it comes to the history of Sephardic Jews, but to study, let's say, at the same time, different towns, if you know that there were indeed important flows between these two towns and so on. So it would be absolutely fascinating to reconstruct the movement of these individual and family across Italy, Europe, later on the Americas, and to also to see what originated these population flows among Sephardic Jews, which are the main reason. So there is a lot of work to do. It's not going to be easy. And Adam Brown mentioned, yes, this is why exactly we are studying now this DNA testing and so on, which can provide clarity to this. So it's 9 o'clock, 9:01, and I think I can finish here, David and Tom.
Thank you. That was absolutely outstanding. My mind is in overdrive. Sorry. I'll quickly ask two questions because I'm sure other people have questions. You mentioned at the beginning that families from Spain were going to Naples, which I assume then was part of the Crown of Aragon, and then at the end you were showing how Spanish families from Naples moved on to other places. For the Portuguese families that ended up in Ancona and Ferrara, I think you had one example of a family which was in Rome, but obviously Ancona and Ferrara are on the eastern side of Italy, and the Portuguese are coming from the west. So are they sort of crossing through the Papal States and Duchy of Tuscany, or are they going around, or do you have any idea?
Sometimes they were attracted by, by legislation. They knew that there was a favorable legislation for them to Ancona and Ferrara, so they went straight to Ancona and Ferrara. Other times they might have gone to, of course, they might have gone through, as I said, many of them expelled from Spain. Okay, these are the Spanish ones, not the Portuguese one, but they went to Naples. Naples was some sort of, the Kingdom of Naples was some sort of independent at the time from Aragon. It lasted not long, but and then of course there were this expulsion from Naples in 1510. So which, yes, we know that some Portuguese Jews arrived, for instance, directly to Savoy. There was, I didn't mention it, but in 1572 there was the Duke of Savoy also promulgated a federal legislation for Portuguese Jews. But then next year he married someone from the Spanish crown, so he stopped the whole thing. So because of course he had to because then, which was one of the conditions for the marriage to take place.
Yes.
So there's a lot to study in this respect. But indeed, some of the flows we know from Portugal, they arrive, even if it's on the other side of Italy, they arrive directly to Ancona and Ferrara. But it is not very well studied. We know that the community of Ancona starts in the 1530s, the Portuguese community of Ancona. And it is key important because it was I believe, together, possibly together with Ferrara, the first established Portuguese community by itself. You know, people, when you say Portuguese, Portuguese nation, Nassau in Italy, everyone thinks of Livorno. No, Livorno comes very late compared to what, compared to 60 years before, 60 years later, compared to Ancona and Ferrara, indeed.
Thank you. You also mentioned shipping records in Naples, in Ancona and Ferrara, but specific to Ancona and Ferrara, I wonder how detailed the records they have of Portuguese use, not just shipping records, but I don't know, tax records or census or
I mean,
legal.
there is a lot of work. There is a lot of work to be done. The archives in Italy are a wealth of information. You need time, and
Yeah.
of course, you need a lot of time to dig into this. So, for instance, when I mention Naples, because we have the contract, actually, the source is not Italy, it's Spain, because we had the contracts that the Aragonese community was together with they were sea captain from Genoa, actually, and we have the contracts. Yes, you will take us to Naples, hundreds of Jews and so on. So we have this contract coming from the archives in Spain. From Ferrara, on the contrary, we have the contracts that the Portuguese Jews from Ferrara signed with, I don't know whom, to be fair, but that would carry hundreds of them to, at least hundreds of them to Salonika. It's a matter of digging into the archives. Really, yeah.
Thank you, Todd.
Uh, Luca, thank you for such an interesting talk. Um, of course, the situation in Italy was very complicated because of all those nation states that were there, all those different kingdoms, the papal state, etc., etc. Um, that must have impacted the story of the Jews in Italy, isn't it?
Yes, as I said, they were in competition. The different states they reckoned that these Sephardic Jews were a source of wealth and they could increase trade and so on. So there are, as I said, in Venice, the authorities were justifying the fact they were giving privilege with the fact that these people were bringing wealth, they were creating trade and so on. It was very important that they would stay in Italy and not go to the Ottoman Empire, because then it would be Ottoman Empire that would have benefited from this. And this was detrimental to Christianity, of course. So there were, of course, it was an excuse, but there were an excuse for the benefit of reassuring the church. But you had all this competition, and what I want to say is that these Sephardic communities, they had even bigger privilege than the Italian Jews had. The Italian Jews, so the Italian Jews, and this was a matter of conflict when it came to the payment of taxes, of course, because they had a lot of privilege also when it came to taxes and so on that the Italian Jews didn't have in some circumstances. And they could, the Italian Jews, the Italian communities for instance, in the Marche region where Ancona is places, they start arriving to the Marche region at the end of the 13th century, and they sign contracts to be money lenders, basically, to open small banks in small towns and so on. So it is a completely different, let's say, origin when it comes to the main occupation of these Jews, because Italian Jews, they are born, these communities in Central North Italy, they are born when family came to open small bank here and there, and which is totally different from the Sephardic Jews who were traders, and they got, let's say, they receive all this privilege because the local authorities knew that indeed they would trade with the Eastern Mediterranean, so they would bring wealth and money, and this is why they were trying to attract them. And my point is that this competition between Italian city and state was very beneficial for the Sephardic, Spanish, and Portuguese Jews.
Okay. Several people asked for your contact information in the chat. Are you willing to give that?
Sure. So it's a new, so it's Luca, Luca dot Ascoli. How do you say it in English? Aerobase in French, chiocciola in Italian. Yes, at outlook.com.
Okay. It's Luca.
Yeah, that's it. Yes, that's it.
Okay. Uh, a question for me for someone who is not here. Do you know where the family Jamis da Fonseca is
Camis
located?
da Fonseca?
Yes.
Yes. In fact, my own cousins are Camits, so I know.
Mhm.
So we have, I think they were from, we have the Camits and the separate Camits, which was Camis da Fonseca. Camis da Fonseca were separate Jews, and I think we find them in Venice.
In
I
Venice.
don't know. I need to look at it. I need to look at it. But you please
Oh,
write to me, and then I will see what. But I know that my cousin Camits, they took contact with Camis da Fonseca to see if they were indeed, let's say, considered the same family, and they didn't find, let's say, a link between these Camis and Camis. So we think that because we know that the Camits, they were Spanish Jews. They were
mm,
originally from Navarra, from Tudela, and then they arrived in Italy with the expulsion. The Camis da Fonseca, on the contrary, they were Portuguese Jews and arrived in Italy later on.
okay. Thank you. Bernard Miller has his hand up. Bernard, can you unmute?
I'm trying. Hi, Luca. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. And there are so many questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to limit myself. Um, I just wondered if you could say a couple of words generally about the form of government and the relations between Ferrara and Ancona during this period. And secondly, I wrote to you a few weeks ago about my ninth, 10th great grandfather, a Baruch from Venice, who had the surname Baruch Sarfati, but I think the Sarfati came from his wife's family. But they had married into, there seemed to be a lot of marriages with people with the surname Ferrares, which I presume is a Hispanicized version of a patronymic from Ferrara, although there were also Portuguese Jews called Ferreira, and I think some of those became Ferrara. I wondered if you could say something about the Ferrares surname. Um, and I have a third question, which is very general, but it's about the role of the medical schools, particularly the Padova Medical School, in the integration of Jews, because it looks like it was enormously important in enabling Jews from across the whole of Europe to integrate into social or into society in different countries. And it was important for both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. And final question linked to that, I only discovered yesterday about the Salerno School of Medicine, which predates the major expulsions from Spain and Portugal, but which apparently was teaching medicine which brought together Greek and Roman and Jewish and Arabic medical traditions in the 10th or 11th centuries. And although it's pre what we now consider Sephardic, I wondered whether you have any connections there or information on connections there and any books on either of those medical schools. Sorry for so many questions.
No, so first question, yes, the former government of Ancona and Ferrara. Ancona was one of the 7 sea republic in Italy. We had 7 sea republic and maintained its independence until 1532, I think, when it was finally taken over by the popes, the state of the church. So nominally it was already under the state of the church, but it was autonomous politically. And then in the 16th century, the state of the church takes over also politically, and so Ancona loses its autonomy, independence. Ferrara was there was a duke. There was a duke, and he was ruling upon the territories of Ferrara and Mantova. Ferrara was always under the threat of being annexed to the state of the church because the popes really wanted to become part of a state of the church. And eventually, towards the end of the 16th century, Ferrara becomes part of the state of the church. So the duke, they signed an agreement because there was an issue of a duke who didn't have any son and so on. So there is an agreement, and let's say the family of the duke, the remaining family of the duke, goes to Modena, and this is the beginning of the Ducate of Modena, and Ferrara enters, becomes part of the state of the church towards the end of the 16th century. You mentioned the Ferraris.
Yeah.
I will tell you my opinion. I don't believe there is a connection with Ferrara because there is this surname, I know that a lot of Italian surnames, including my one, Italian Jewish surnames, come from towns, okay?
Yeah.
But there is no, there are, I didn't, there are no, I didn't see people called Ferrara in the Jewish people called Ferrara in the past centuries. Maybe there were, I don't know, maybe a few of them, but it is not one of those surnames that you would expect among Italian Jews. So perhaps there is a link with Ferreira or Ferro. Also, Ferro was Portuguese surname. So I I would be very careful in trying to make a link between these Ferraris and
Yeah,
Ferrari.
no, I just wondered if it was connected because some of my Baruchs from Venice had married Ferrareses, and I wondered whether the name was in any way connected. But it's spelt with a single or with single R's, so it suggests that it wasn't from Ferrara in Italy, but I wondered.
Okay. Yeah, there was a medical school in Padua, which was the medical school in Padua always welcomed Jewish students, both Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Italian, all the communities were there. It was a constant source of friction because Padua was part of Venice before. It was a constant source of friction between Venetian authorities and the popes because the popes wanted them to. It was not so much that Jews could enter the school. It was mainly about the fact that Jews were free and Jews could move and Jews didn't have to wear the famous sign, which so this was the main source of friction between the Venetian authorities and but yes, for instance, the Al-Costantini, which I mentioned before, they were a family of doctors. You see them some of them going to Ferrara, and you see many, indeed, Sephardic Jews, sorry, to Padua. You see many Sephardic Jews entering the medical school of Padua. Salerno, yes, there was a school of medicine, but I'm not sure whether there were some or many Jews there. I would need to study to study better the issue.
Thank you.
Yeah. Tom David, I see some questions sometimes appearing
in the chat.
in the chat.
Yes.
I think someone asked about the Recanati family.
Yes.
Yes, the Recanati family was a family of Italian Jews who Recanati is between Ancona and Ascoli, basically. So it was a family of Italian Jews who gets the surname from the place they were living, which was the most common event in the Marche region. And then we know that they leave to go to the to the Eastern Mediterranean. So there is this Recanati family leaving Italy, going to at least one branch of it, going to the Eastern Mediterranean. And I know that there are also some Recanati in Israel, which is a very wealthy family, I think, the Recanati. And at some stage they leave for the Eastern Mediterranean. I think Salonika, of course, I will have to check it, but it is well documented, the fact that they leave Italy at some stage to go to the Eastern Mediterranean.
Thank you, Luca. I see it's 9:15. I think it's time to wrap it up. Thank you very much, Luca, for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
it shows that we have to know our history to be able to do our genealogy. As always, I thank our patrons who make all of these talks possible. And we hope to see you all in 2 weeks' time when, let me see, Jessica Maya Marglin will speak on Jewish law and consular courts, looking at Morocco, 18th century. So that promises to be a great talk also. So thank you all for looking and participating, and we see you all in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone.
Luca,
Bye-bye.
once again.